focusing on issues around business, policy, and education with leaders across local, national, and international communities, making a difference and driving business success. This is Connect and Collaborate on KDMT, Denver's Money Talk, 1690 AM.
Are you all there?
Yes. Hi, Morgan. We are just now starting the show. We are live. I'm Alex Hopkins here with Connect and Collaborate. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today and all week, we are talking NAFTA. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so it's a pretty big hot topic. And we decided that if we were going to talk NAFTA now, we needed to talk NAFTA before, right? And so we have a few gentlemen with us. We have Jim Reis here. And Jim was the former chief executive and president of the World Trade Center. And we also have Jim Nelson in with us, who was big into the Gates Rubber Company, the General Counsel with Gates Rubber Company, excuse me, when NAFTA was coming about. And then on the phone, hi, Morgan, how are you?
Good.
Good. We have Morgan Smith, who was the former director of the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade, and he got to be right in the ear of the governor as this NAFTA thing was going down the first time around. So, gentlemen, I'm going to let you take it away from here. I figure we'll do some background. Why NAFTA in the first place, right?
And why don't you start off, Morgan, since you really brought Colorado into the international marketplace with your efforts working with Governor Romer back in the 80s, and as NAFTA became an important topic in the early 90s. So why don't you start off a little bit with some of your thoughts and comments?
Well, let me start off, because actually this initiative sort of started under Governor Lamb in the mid-'80s. And one of my first international business experiences was when I was Commissioner of Agriculture, and I went to Mexico with the Colorado Wheat Administrative Committee. And they were working very hard to open up markets in Mexico. Actually, that was even before the state had any formal trade office. Once I got started under Governor Lamb, we focused on Japan, but that economy began to tank. Japan is not an easy place to do business with. It's far away and a very different language. It just seemed obvious from the beginning that Mexico was a market that we ought to really focus on. As well, obviously, as Canada, which was one of our biggest markets all along. But Mexico had a lot of barriers. And the intent of NAFTA was to level out the playing field between our two countries, but particularly between Mexico and the U.S., because at that time, the tariffs on the Mexican side for U.S. products were higher than those on the U.S. side. So if we could level them out through NAFTA, our companies, our U.S. companies, our Colorado companies, would be the obvious beneficiaries. And it always seemed surprising to me that there was so much opposition. Because the more products you export, the more products you have to make back home in Colorado, the more employees you have to make those products. It's an obvious way to create jobs, and those jobs tend to be higher paying than jobs in companies that don't do international business. So that was the thinking behind this. In regard to Governor Romer, he really took charge. I remember once we went to a big union meeting where everybody in the room was against NAFTA. And Governor Romer just walked in there and said, look, we're going to support this. I know you don't like it. I know you disagree, but we're going to support it, no matter what you think. And I thought that took a lot of guts, and it really set the state in a forward motion in regard to NAFTA. So that's a little bit of the background.
The other piece, Morgan, is that we already had that free trade agreement with Canada from 1989, and the two countries were already working. I'm sure there was some concern. I didn't get involved in the discussions in that very much. I'm sure there was some concern on the part of labor, but Canada has an economic situation more similar to the United States, labor rules, labor, costs of labor, and those types of things. So I don't think the unions were quite as concerned as when all of a sudden we said we're going to open up the market with Mexico, and then along came our friend, talking earlier, our friend Ross Perot talking about the giant sucking sound of all the jobs going down to Mexico, and it did cause a lot of concern among labor in the United States and I think the general public. Wait a minute, what's going to happen here?
I think in a way, perhaps we have never made a clear enough case, not just for NAFTA, but for export promotion, for international business in general, because it's always been easy for somebody like Perot to use this as kind of a whipping boy in a political sense, and people do respond to that. And one of the issues is that when a company is increasing its sales via exporting, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the employees, the existing employees and the new employees, know that the job growth is due to a new market in Mexico or a new market in Canada. It's sort of an invisible thing. You're making more products than you were a month ago, but you don't necessarily know that it's because your leadership has opened a new market, and therefore you're able to make more and sell more.
Well, that's right. And in fact, the job loss, and there was some, and some readjustment is quite obvious. But the job gains, as you point out, are not nearly as obvious. And many studies, many studies were done afterwards, and it appeared to be net gains. And in fact, I know of situations in the company I was with, we had a net gain in all three countries. And people say, well, how can you do that? Well, as a matter of fact, our markets are not zero-sum, and we were importing from other countries. And by rationalizing our product lines, we could actually lower cost because we can make all of a particular product in one country and thereby gain market share. And with market share increased, you can increase employment. Now, that's pretty subtle, and it sometimes it doesn't get the headlines that a job loss or a factory closure shows. But in the other issue that Jim and I were talking about earlier was the fact that we all saw Mexico as a developing market. And if we could get that market developed, we've got a really great target for exports.
And it works to the favor of Colorado in a couple of areas. The technology area, for instance, as the Mexican population increased their incomes, all of a sudden they could buy higher technology type products. I think there's a part of it. They could buy better agricultural products in certain cases, although they had their own agricultural industry. But to this day, we export beef because of the quality of the animals that we have up here. So there are a lot of things that I think a lot of people saw or hoped would happen. And just following on what Jim said, that the company I worked for before I joined the World Trade Center and became president in 1990 had multi-divisions, and I was in charge of exports. And the divisions that had 1 or 2% of their business going into the international market really didn't want Jim Reis to stop by and bother them. The other guys that had 40% of their business going into the international marketplace were on my back all the time. Can you increase our share in Japan? Can you increase our share in other parts of the world? And so that was the challenge I think that Colorado faced. We weren't an awfully big exporter of products back then. I mean, it was still, I think, what, $2+ billion, but it's grown significantly since then.
Yeah, another aspect of this whole thing, and really came home to me because in my position, I spent a lot of time in Mexico and some time in Canada, was the development of the business culture in Mexico. Canada and the U.S. pretty much shared the same business culture and a similar legal system. As a lawyer, that's something I would appreciate. But by NAFTA, all of a sudden, made the Mexicans look primarily to the U.S. and Canada. Oh, they did in some certain ways, but we always had a flood of new students coming into our universities from Mexico who became used to coming for MBAs and law degrees and so forth, becoming used to how we did business. And in fact, they started changing their laws to reflect that. Mexico adopted, for example, the UNCITRAL model law for international private dispute resolution. I can talk about that a little later. But so we saw that as an opportunity because there was a recognition at the time that Mexico's political system was undergoing a major change from the dominance of the traditional PRI party into a much more open economy.
In anticipation of this discussion, I was thinking about that trade mission that we first took down, and I think it was in 1992, but to Mexico, and we were working with some of the other World Trade Centers, and their participation fell through, and you had a young woman by the name of Alice Grigg working for you, Morgan.
Right.
And thanks to you, you sent Alice down there to bail us out. We took, I think, 23 different people down, groups of people, and had to set up meetings and whatnot. And it was an interesting start to trying to get people to understand that Mexico is a good place to do business, that there are some very sophisticated business people down there. And big companies know that and knew that. They've been down there before. But the smaller companies, which make up a large part of Colorado's businesses, certainly back then, just were very hesitant. And so
that's right.
I was smiling as I thought about that and just getting the whole thing organized, because you had run a couple of trade missions, but I was not a trade mission expert at the time, and we owe a lot to Alice for bailing us out and setting up the meetings that started things going.
There's another non-business aspect to NAFTA that I just read about a week or so ago in the Wall Street Journal. The dean of the Fletcher School of Diplomacy, who's a retired admiral, I can't think of his name, it's kind of hard to pronounce, he said that the sense of cooperation between the two countries that has developed through NAFTA has led to cooperation in other areas like law enforcement. And the ability of the United States to extradite major drug criminals from Mexico has gone up dramatically since the passage of NAFTA. It used to be very hard to extradite these guys, and of course, they wouldn't serve much time in Mexico for crimes that essentially occurred in the U.S. But since the passage of NAFTA, it's been much, much easier, and that's because if you tend to cooperate in one area, as in NAFTA, it has an overlap in other areas, which can be of great benefit to us, because obviously, enforcement between our two countries is very, very important.
Yes, definitely. Just to reiterate, we are here today with Jim Reis and Jim Nelson. Jim Reis was the former president and chief executive of the World Trade Center Denver, and Jim Nelson was a part of the General Counsel of the Gates Rubber Company, and this all happened when NAFTA was coming about the first time. And on the phone with us, we do have Morgan Smith, who was the former director of the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. And just a bit ago, Mr. Jim Nelson, I like to differentiate here since I've got two of you. You were mentioning the international law dispute resolutions.
Right.
If you'd like to touch on that for us.
I have to say I'm involved today with NAFTA operationally in the sense that under NAFTA, in fact, it's Article 2022, so-called, an advisory committee was established to the NAFTA Secretariat. The NAFTA Secretariat consists of the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, the head of SAE, this is the Secretary of Economy of Mexico, and the Ministry of Industry and Trade in Canada. They have a representative, and that consists of the Secretariat, which reviews and kind of operates NAFTA. This particular committee has 8 Americans, and I'm privileged to be one of those, 8 Canadians and 8 Mexicans, and our role is to advise the Secretariat on how to improve the facilities for private dispute resolution. Now, in trade, like in any human relationship, there are going to be disputes, and most and many of them can be settled by negotiation, but occasionally they need to go to a third party or the assistance of a third party. In the U.S., we go to court. We do have arbitration. We have mediation. But there hasn't been much structure across borders. And under NAFTA, we have this particular group, and we meet every year, rotating among the 3 countries, to discuss how to promote a private dispute resolution so that if a Mexican vendor were to sell into Canada and has a dispute, they can find an easy and swift way to resolve matters without going to a court, an unfamiliar court system. And we look at impediments, what issues there might be, and how to provide facilities. And then we give reports back to the Secretariat on what improvements can be made to promote these dispute resolution mechanisms. Because that's the nature of trade. There are contracts, and there will be from time to time disputes. There are also other dispute mechanisms that relate to the governments, and those are somewhat controversial, and there are recommendations from the business community to help modify those, and many of those, both the Mexicans and the Canadians agree. So in fact, our committee has made a recommendation on some changes that we feel would improve our performance. So as an agreement, it can be improved, and I'm hopeful that negotiations will make it better.
Do you have a specific example of one of the improvements that have been made, or are you allowed to say that? I should ask, maybe.
Well, there's some things that we do oppose. We believe the idea of a sunset on this is inappropriate, because it would certainly inhibit long-term strategic investment and making moves for training and the like. But we're talking about perhaps better mechanisms when there's an issue of government support for a particular product. People may have heard about the softwood issue coming out of Canada, and the fact that the Canadians purportedly, and there's some dispute about how they support that and how it puts the disadvantage of the people in the United States, the softwood producers. And maybe some better mechanisms. We're looking at better expertise and trying to understand the facts of the situation, which is so often the case in disputes, is really trying to understand the facts.
You know, Morgan, when we talked last week, you mentioned something that I'm not privy to the trade statistics like I used to be, so I don't have all those numbers in front of me. But one of the complaints that President Trump has been using for renegotiation is the trade balance in goods specifically. And yes, there is an imbalance, and it has grown over the years. But people don't, again, when you look at specific industries and specific states, people don't always see what is happening. And you mentioned, the point I'm making is, you mentioned that New Mexico's exports to Mexico are higher than Colorado's.
That is correct, although some of that may be counting goods that cross the border between New Mexico and Mexico as New Mexico exports, when they may have come from other parts of the country.
And
but
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I spoke this morning to the trade director for the state of New Mexico, and he sees these numbers really going up. One reason is, and this is very dependent on these negotiations, there are two crossing points between Mexico and New Mexico. One is Santa Teresa, right next to El Paso, and one further to the west. And for the state I live in now, New Mexico, these are really important business opportunities. New Mexico is way behind Colorado in terms of economic vitality. But taking advantage of the crossing, there's already, I go through that area like once a month, and there's a lot of new construction, new industry, all of which is going to help New Mexico, but it's also going to have goods from all over the country get into Mexico. And if NAFTA gets really roughed up by President Trump, that could all collapse. And it would be a big loss for this state, but also for the whole country.
Yeah, and that was the point I was trying to make, and I wanted you to emphasize it from the viewpoint of actually living down there in New Mexico. But again, that's something that I've always pointed out to people that, for instance, Colorado exports to certain parts of the world are not as high as we would expect them to be, but that's simply because there's a company, a distributor, an agent, maybe if it's going to Asia in California, or if it's going to Mexico, somebody in Texas or New Mexico or California or Arizona, a distributor who does business regularly in Mexico, and so they're better equipped to handle the transaction, and so they buy it. It actually leaves Colorado as a product going to Arizona, but then it goes on to Mexico. And there's a lot more of this going on than people understand. And again, that's always disturbed me that people say, well, we don't sell anything there. Well, depends on your business, number one, but also you better look at your distribution chains.
Well, in addition, these trade imbalances are really don't tell the whole economic story, because how about the trade and services? For example, a lot of licensing of technology is made into Mexico, and there's a flow of royalties into the United States, even to the extent of music. Yeah. Think about the CDs that are sold, and the musicians get paid, but that isn't counted in the traditional trade in goods, and so that's very, very substantial. Plus, obviously, any profits made from companies that are owned by U.S. companies and joint ventures and the like. So this trade imbalance is kind of misleading sometimes.
Yeah, and that's, people tend to talk about trade in goods, but services include educational services, software, travel, the types of things that you talked about. The technology areas where there is no good that you can grab, but there's a lot of knowledge going, and the money's coming back into, and the jobs exist here that it created.
Absolutely. So we've got just 1 minute here. Final thoughts on this NAFTA. Where do you think it's going to go, fellas?
I'm certainly troubled that Gary Cohen has resigned from his position in the Trump administration, and that the person sort of replacing him, or at least replacing him in terms of influence, I wish I could think of his name now, is so anti-trade that the pressures and the influences on President Trump are kind of going in the wrong direction as far as we're concerned. Kind of going in an anti-free trade direction, and that's very concerning.
Yeah. That is concerning. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I'm so sorry. We are out of time. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you giving us the history on NAFTA. Be sure to visit us at cobrt.com. On our radio page, you can hear this podcast. Tomorrow morning it will be available. Thank you. Stay tuned after this break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Denver's only business radio